Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is distinguished New Mexico author Hampton Sides. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be back with you.
It's wonderful having you back. We're here to celebrate the paperback release of your latest book, In the Kingdom of Ice. Now, this caused quite an ice storm, quite a flurry of awards and good reviews. Tell us a little about this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a book about an early American attempt on the North Pole, one of the first official ones, and it's going back to the early days of polar fever and this nagging, gnawing need that we need to know that we had back then for what is at the top of the world. We didn't know if there were holes up there that led down into the earth. That was one of the leading theories. One of the other theories that this expedition was designed to test was whether there was a belief that there was an open polar sea, a warm body of water up there that was fed by the Gulf Stream and other oceanic currents. So in the summer of 1879, the captain, George DeLong, and his 32 men and their 40 dogs left the United States, went past Alaska, which we had fairly recently purchased from the Russians, and looked for this open polar sea. They didn't find the open polar sea. What they found was ice, lots and lots of ice.
Well, they were trapped in ice for 2 years.
2 years.
That's what makes it such a wonderful summer read.
Yeah,
there's a lot of ice.
It's literary air conditioning.
Yeah.
It'll cool you off. That period of when they're stuck in the ice, certainly. They start to go crazy. They're not actually suffering, though. They got plenty of food. They're just waiting for something to happen. When finally, in 2 years later, in the summer of 1881, the ship is crushed by the enormous pressure of the pack, and it sinks to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And so these men and their dogs and 3 open boats and very few belongings are stranded out on the ice pack. And the plan is to use that summer and a limited amount of time to reach the nearest landmass, which is the central Arctic coast of Siberia, about 1,000 miles away. So it's really one of these great survival stories, a story of comradeship and friendship and leadership as they try to hold this thing together during that summer and make it to open water where they can sail the rest of the way to Siberia.
Now, you make this tale, when reading it is an absolute page turner. It's riveting. It's like you are there. Even the dialogue, you almost feel like you're eavesdropping. Mm-hmm. And then it's gotten so many wonderful reviews. You have a way of making this adventure and this challenge a metaphor for the travails we all face. And we wonder, what would I have done? Well, I wouldn't have been. Yeah.
Well, that's something you're always asking yourself with these Arctic stories. Invariably things go wrong. They go north, everything goes south. And so you ask yourself, how would I survive this? What's combination of qualities would I try to summon? Whether there's a sense of humor or religious faith or physical stamina, and it's also a study in leadership. You're constantly asking, did DeLong make the right decision here, there, in the next place? And it does become a metaphor for all of our travails that we experience. One example, in the book, there is a place where they're having a great success. They think they're marching to the south in making great strides when they take a positional reading after 2 weeks and realize that the ice over which they're struggling is actually drifting faster to the north than they're moving south. So they've been going exactly backwards for 2 weeks, and it was a demoralizing, needless to say, period of that. But they do hold it together. DeLong proves to be an amazing leader. And I was drawn to this story mainly because of him and because of the fact that I had never heard of this expedition. Almost no one has. It's even though a very, very important expedition in its day, subject of best-selling books and inquiries and parades and monuments, it was almost completely forgotten. And so I love to resurrect these kinds of stories and bring them to the place where I think they belong.
Well, speaking of monuments, one of the most chilling photographs you have in the book is that the icy cross in the U.S. Naval Academy, they've a monument to them, and it's a cross, but part of the sculpture is this ice dripping from it. It makes you cold just looking
at it.
Yeah.
And apparently there's a ritual at the Naval Academy where, they take the midshipmen have kind of a hazing ritual, and at midnight they have to go and count the number of icicles on the Jeannette cross and report back. Your tax dollars at work, evidently. But yeah, I mean, it is the one place where the Jeannette is celebrated and known is in Navy circles, because it was a U.S. naval expedition commanded by a Navy captain. So the Navy people know about it. But after the book came out, though, I mean, it was a bestseller. It has been optioned to be a miniseries. There's now a group of scientists, both Russian and American, that want to stage an expedition to go find the wreck, which is way off in Arctic waters and Russian waters, and which I'll be a part of if that actually happens. So there's been a lot of new interest in the Jeannette because of the book.
But there's also a pattern of the ship will get stranded in the Arctic, then a rescue ship goes to rescue it, but the rescue ship gets stranded.
Yes.
And then someone goes to rescue them. This
Yeah.
is a very bad domino effect.
Bad then. Now we hope with the these Russian icebreakers are pretty indestructible, and with GPS and with all the tools that we have now, we won't suffer the same fate. We won't get stuck in the ice. But it is true that this expedition, the Jeannette, no one had heard from them for 2 years. It's like they went off the face of the
and the tragic
backside
letters
of the moon.
from his wife.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So his wife writes all these letters to him in the hope that
To the captain, right?
the captain
Yeah.
will receive them by way of some Arctic whalers. They're tragic letters. They're
Yeah.
beautiful letters, and I found them sort of by accident, by cold calling all the DeLong people in the phone book in New England, because I'd heard there were some survivors, and found this woman, and she had a trunk, literally one of these classic scenarios, a trunk in the attic full of letters, and she let me she loaned me
And
those.
they were from... Oh, and she wrote in duplicates.
Mhm.
So this is from Mrs.
Mrs. DeLong, Emma DeLong, to her husband, the captain, during the summers of 1879, 80, and 81. She called them her letters to nowhere. They never reached him, but she had made copies, and in some cases the letters had returned back to her. So that forms actually a pretty important part of the book. Yeah.
I want to talk with you about your background. I want you to tell us about your background, because a lot of the things you did in researching this 1870s story were modern journalistic techniques. Now, you have a degree in history, but is history changing? What is narrative nonfiction? You're known as a best-selling author of narrative nonfiction, these gripping epics that you write about, but they're rooted firmly in history.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a question of nomenclature for the kind of work that I do. It always bothers me, for example, that what I do has a negative in front of it, like nonfiction. Shouldn't it be the other way around? It should be truth versus non-truth.
Yeah.
And there's also a question even more narrowly in the profession of, like, do we call it literary history, literary nonfiction, literary journalism? Creative nonfiction. I hate all those terms. They're not quite right. It should be called history. But unfortunately, in the last 100 years or so, academic historians and the profession of history has gravitated in a different direction. And most academic history, I'm afraid, is deadly dull. Chloroform in print. It'll put you to sleep. It is aiming increasingly for a very narrow audience of other scholars. And so, but the early historians like Herodotus and Thucydides and Tacitus and so forth, I mean, they certainly understood that they wanted an audience. They knew how to hold an audience. They knew how to tell a story. And that's what narrative history strives to do, is tell a story rather than argue a very narrow case for a very obscure, esoteric topic. So I'm looking for a general audience. I'm looking for great tales that have great characters, and most of the kinds of attributes that I guess you now more commonly associate with a novel. For foreshadowing, suspense,
Point of view.
dialogue when you can find it, point of view, shifting points of view, multiple narrative lines that intersect and are braided. So those are the kinds of things that, a narrative historian, I think, is looking for. And really, the history that's being read and is being reviewed and taken seriously in popular circles is generally being written by narrative historians, most of whom are really journalists who got into the history game a little later. It's a golden age for that. I mean, there's David McCullough and Nathaniel Philbrick and S.C. Gwynn, and I mean, I could go on and on. There's a lot of great people out there doing what I do, and but it's an interesting time to be practicing this craft.
Well, you practice it well. I want to look at one of your best-selling books. This is the old hardbound. The paperback has a cover with Kit Carson in it. It's called Blood and Thunder. And I know someone who buys them 20 at a time and gives them to everyone he knows. It's called An Epic of the American West. It's the best thing that's been written about Kit Carson. Mm-hmm. Tell me, and what you had to work with as a historian. You said you looked at his papers. There were 2 papers.
Yeah. Well, Kit Carson was illiterate, and so he didn't produce many papers, and it created a challenge for me as a historian to go around the country finding archives where there was stuff written about him. But I wanted to use Kit Carson, and it's not a biography of Kit Carson, but I use Kit Carson as kind of a through line, almost like Forrest Gump. He's a guy who had this curious knack for intersecting with history and with major figures all over the American West. Whenever something was up, he was in the center of it. And yet here he was, this illiterate backwoodsman originally from Missouri, who wandered out here and through his own wit and through his sort of hard-won experience as a mountain man, as a scout, as a what I call a pre-Westerner, because this was before Westerns. This is, there's no barbed wire, there's no cowboy hats. There's most of the white guys are speaking French or Spanish, and they're on the backs of mules, not horses, and they're usually chasing sheep, not cattle. Yeah. It's a very different West. But he was this pre-Westerner. He was this great character to follow, to try to understand the larger story of Manifest Destiny and how the whole western third of the continent was captured and conquered and subdued in one generation, his generation, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and finally he died in the 1860s. So.
Now, although he was illiterate, he spoke 7 or 8 Indian languages. And recently in Taos, and we talked about this on the air once, they came in, they were going to rename everything that had Kit Carson's name on it, like Kit Carson Park, Kit Carson's house, Carson National Forest. And actually people were outraged about the effort to kind of sanitize or revise history.
Right. It's still controversial, and people are always trying to find safe history, but history is not for sissies. It's Thomas Jefferson was a great man. There's no question about it. He also had slaves, as did Washington. But are we going to sanitize them from our history as well? No, I think the better course is to sort of recognize who these men were in all their complexity, their good and their bad, and to try to understand the times that they lived in. And not to judge them by present-day standards of equality or women's rights or racial equality or whatever standard we might have now. Thank God we've evolved as a society from the days of Kit Carson, because they were very, very violent times. And he's the kind of guy that if you had to go back in time and live in those times, you'd want him on your side. He was a great fighter. He was someone who was really calm and poised in tense situations. He knew the West extremely well. He knew all the river systems. He had been everywhere and he really knew everybody, and was very close friends with many Indian tribes. You mentioned he spoke multiple native tongues. He married an Arapaho woman. His first wife was Arapaho. He was not an Indian hater in any sense of the word, but he is best known perhaps for his conquest of the Navajo people, their long walk They are, of course, a very important tribe, one of the largest, living on the largest reservation now. So, of course, their enemy is quite well known as now as an enemy of much of Indian America. But that's a very simplistic view.
Right. Now, you have said that one of the things you're fascinated in your books as you work on them is character. You're attracted to strong characters.
Right.
Kit Carson was certainly a strong character. You have written an intriguing book about the man who killed Martin Luther King. It's called Hellhound on His Trail, The Stalking of Martin Luther King and the International Hunt for His Assassin. Now this, you swam in dangerous seas when you did this. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Memphis, born and raised there, and it's the biggest thing that ever happened to my hometown, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I wanted to write about the event. I wanted to try to piece it together and deconstruct it. But then I became intrigued by this character, James Earl Ray. Who was he exactly? I became convinced that he, in fact, did kill King. I leave a lot of doors open about conspiracies because I think he did have some help, but I do believe he fired the shot. And once I kind of reached that position in the research, I decided to really follow him and read what he read and go to all the places where he went, both before and after the assassination. It's not very well known that it took 65 days before he was captured in Heathrow Airport in London on his way to Rhodesia, where if he had made it, and he almost got on this airplane, he probably would have eluded capture, would have gone to Rhodesia where there was no extradition treaty, and he would have gotten away with this crime. So it's a fascinating kind of international detective story about how the FBI and Scotland Yard and a lot of other agencies finally caught this creepy guy. I mean, he's fascinatingly creepy. You can't invent a character like James Earl Ray, and kept me busy for a number of years, and I really enjoyed that project a lot. It was fascinating.
We're speaking today with Hampton Sides. We're celebrating the paperback release of In the Kingdom of Ice. We're talking about Hellhound on This Trail and the man who killed Martin Luther King. You make me as interested as you clearly were. This guy was an escape artist. Mm-hmm.
Well, he did escape from 2 maximum security prisons.
With the oldest trick in the book. What was
like the bread box kind of thing. Yeah. It was a big bread crate that he got into from the bakery of the prison. And he was one of these guys that was both brilliant and stupid at the same time. He would do these brilliant things that involved a lot of planning and scheming, and then he would do one stupid thing, like leaving the rifle near the scene of the crime in Memphis, and a bundle full of stuff that ultimately got him caught. So he's an interesting cat, and I love in my histories to try to find these kinds of characters and follow them. And sometimes they're heroic, and sometimes they're, like in Ray's case, very very dark and very complex, and kind of a vessel of the zeitgeist. I mean, he was a real creature of the 1960s in many ways, and I had a lot of fun kind of trying to understand the complexities of his personality.
You don't only write gripping books, narrative, nonfiction. You're an editor-at-large for Outside Magazine.
Outside Magazine,
so
which is here in Santa Fe, yeah.
Do a lot of journalism magazine articles. You had the cover story on June's National Geographic about marijuana.
Yeah. So that was certainly an article that caused my teenage son to smirk and some of his friends. But that was a great story, and it's really about the science of cannabis. It's about where we're at now in terms of our knowledge of the plant itself and the compounds that are in it, the medical uses. There's a geneticist in there who's literally doing the genome for cannabis, and kind of what's happening in the front lines of cannabis research now that people are starting to recognize, and there's sort of a critical mass of people who understand that this plant has a lot to offer besides just being intoxicating. It's a powerful melange of all these compounds that have all these potential uses.
I'm always impressed by your research, and this is very well researched in terms of the scientific literature. You also point out that no one has ever died of an overdose of marijuana.
Yeah, it is. It can be for certain people a dangerous drug. It's certainly not an innocuous drug, but at the same time, it has never caused a known case of overdose, and that's partly because it is not toxic. It does not kill cells. It is, like alcohol kills liver cells and bad for your brain, and it's bad for your kidneys, and it's toxic. Marijuana is not toxic. I'm not saying it's good for you in every case, and the article is very clear on the research, particularly in terms of the developing brain, the young brain. It can alter the way the young brain grows and develops. So the article is very clear in its parameters. It's not urging people to go out and get high all the time, but it focuses particularly on this one compound called CBD, cannabidiol, which has no psychoactive effect. But this is the compound that clearly helps with tremors and epilepsy, seizures.
Oh,
these children up in Colorado that you've heard about. So I zero in a lot on that one compound, and I go to Israel to interview this kind of the chemist, the patriarch of cannabis science.
and how do you say his name? Because I read it.
You have to kind of cough up a loogie to say it correctly. It's his name is Machulam.
That's
Raphael
thank you.
Machulam.
Yeah.
And he's been studying cannabis since the 1960s. He identified THC. He played a big role in identifying CBD, and almost all this other research that's happened has happened really because of his pioneering work. And but what's interesting is a lot of this research has not happened here in the United States, and that's because it's been scheduled a Schedule I drug, which means it's the federal government position on it is that it's highly addictive, highly dangerous, and has no medical value, in the same category as heroin, which is extraordinary for anyone who has any kind of actual experience with this plant. That seems to be changing. There's a little bit of a sea change away from that position, perhaps to call it a Schedule II drug, in which case then scientists around the country won't be risking their reputations or their financial status with their universities to begin to seriously study and do human clinical trials on this plant.
Now, each one of these books is an investment of years of your life.
Yeah.
So how do you choose? Like 4 years for In the Kingdom of Ice?
It's about 4.
And how long
And of course,
for-
you're not done with it after you finish it, because
No.
you go out to promote it and talk about it. And I've been all over the country with the hardback and now the paperback version of the book. So it's really an investment of really, in some senses, the rest of your life. It's like having a child.
Yeah.
So how do I pick the topics, though?
Yeah.
It's kind of a mystery to me how, or the precise criteria. It has a rational side, which is, good characters, the existence of really good primary documents, a good arc, story arc that has a beginning, middle, end that is satisfying. A story that hasn't been written about, like Lincoln has been written about perhaps too much, you might say. So those are the rational components, the little boxes that I check. But then the irrational side of it is just something that grabs me. It really, that feel that sort of the goosebumps on my neck, and I feel that, this is something that, for reasons I can't fully explain, is something I want to sink my teeth in for all these years. And the new book that I'm working on now is about a storied, very harrowing, a very heroic battle in the Korean War in 1950, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. So it's a battle narrative. I've written around war and in Ghost Soldiers, I certainly kind of get into some battle scenes, but this is the first time where I've really focused entirely on one battle.
I neglected to mention Ghost Soldiers, which was made into a movie called?
The movie was called The Great Raid. It's about the Bataan Death March in the Philippines in World War II.
And an amazing rescue.
And a rescue that happens late in the war of some of the survivors. So this is getting back into a forgotten kind of battle, and in this case, the Korean War. The entire war is practically a forgotten war, and these veterans are near the end of their lives. Many of them have already died, unfortunately. So I'm now traveling around the country interviewing veterans and getting ready to write this next book.
What was it that grabbed you about this battle? Or do we have to wait and read the book?
Well, it has a lot of these components. I mean, a lot of my books are about, men in very extreme environments in which they have to summon every ounce of energy and wit and stamina to get through it. And this was a battle in which the Chinese had entered the war without our really fully knowing it. And 100,000 Chinese surrounded 10,000 Marines in the mountains of North Korea in 20 below weather. And the Marines have to fight their way out of this entrapment. It's really a fighting surrender. I don't want to say surrender. It is a fighting retreat. They do not surrender. They fight their way to the coast. They get out of this situation. And everyone who knows anything about military maneuvers knows that a retreat, an organized, systematic withdrawal, is the hardest maneuver there is in combat. So it's celebrated among the Marines as one of the great accomplishments, certainly in modern Marine history, and that's the focus of the book.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I want to remind our audience, this is In the Kingdom of Ice, paperback, perfect summer read, but really riveting reading, and for anyone who loves the West. They have to read Blood and Thunder, which is named after those penny dreadfuls, those little throwaway novels about life in the West. But this, you go so deep and so rich. It's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you.
And so our guest today is Hampton Sides, author extraordinaire. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.